Good morning and welcome to Around the World with Dane Waters. I am your host. Guess who? Dane Waters. Anyway, happy Easter to the world. Even though I'm a day late, but no, it's a lot's going on. It's a kind of a solemn day where the Pope just passed away, as we all know. And what's interesting, it happens every time when the Pope passes away. The amount of global coverage of the Pope and his death, it's kind of surreal in many ways. But we'll be hearing about that. I think we'll have a new Pope in the next 7 to 10 days. It depends on how the conclave goes. And what's interesting about that is I was just in the Philippines, huge Catholic country. And one of the individuals that's on the short list of being the next Pope is actually a Filipino. So I think that we may see something historical happen where the next Pope may be either Filipino or somebody of African descent. I think one of the archbishops from Ghana is actually on the short list as well. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But my condolences to the all those of my Catholic friends who have lost the Pope. In addition to that, what's going on around the world? Where I just literally returned to London from Asia. The point of my trip there was just to talk about what is the role of China, uh, kind of how we prepare for what's happening with China. I was in Taiwan, the Philippines, Vietnam, and one thing that we saw that was quite interesting is the influence that China has, both about scaring those in the region about their military might, and those economically that are concerned about what China may do economically when it comes to South China Sea. It's a very complex situation. And one thing that was also interesting is that in Vietnam, in South Vietnam, well, even though it's a unified country now, they're about to celebrate on April 30th the 50th anniversary of the unification of the North and the South. And you walk around, and all you see are posters of Ho Chi Minh and Vladimir Lenin celebrating, the defeat of the Americans and the reunification, how great it is. It's a very surreal experience that we'll talk about later in the show. But one thing that we do need to talk about, and that we'll get into in our first segment here, is human rights abuses. One thing that I just wrote an op-ed that's going to appear here pretty soon is that the concern about how American leaders are downplaying the importance of, of human rights abuses and making sure that they're prosecuted correctly, which we'll be talking about for the next 45 minutes. So anyway, let's take a quick break, and we'll be back with our guests to talk about things that are happening around the world. Thank you. Welcome back to Around the World with Dane Waters. So what we're going to talk about on today's show, as you know, in the past, I've had several people on the show talking about human rights abuses, and one of the greatest guests I had was a guy named Berkson Maxim, who's from Ukraine. He was a Russian prisoner of war. He's Ukrainian, but a Russian prisoner of war, and talking about him and his experiences as a prisoner of war. And I've spent a lot of time in Ukraine, both pre-war and post-war. And one of the biggest issues there has been human rights abuses by the Russians. And we're going to talk about, how Russia is really the purveyor of human rights abuses, in my opinion, around the world. But anyway, we're very lucky to have Philip Oboji. Am I saying Obaji? Oboji? How does it say it? Okay.
Obaji.
Obaji. Okay.
Yeah.
I always say this. I really seriously am terrible with names. That's why I always call thank God I could just call my mom Mom, because if I had to call her by her real name, I'd never get it right. So it's a very serious subject. So I want to spend, we have you for a whole 45 minutes. So we're going to break this down into two segments because typically on the show, the way we do it is that we have somebody internationally and then we have a Nigerian guest. Well, you just happen to be an international guy who happens to be Nigerian. So we're going to consolidate. You get to fill both roles today. And it's actually very impressive. You're a very prominent and important Nigerian around the world on the international stage, and we appreciate all that you do. So let's first talk about human rights abuses in your home country of Nigeria. I mean, what's going on there?
Thank you so much for having me, Dean, and I'm looking forward to spending a beautiful 45 minutes with you. Oh, yes. When we talk about human rights abuses in Nigeria, we're talking about so many spheres of abuses, and it's sad. We're talking about arbitrary arrest and detention, which we see happen regularly here in Nigeria. And in this kind of situation, security forces, arbitrary arrest and detain people often without due process or legal basis. And then we also talk about extrajudicial killings, in which security forces sometimes involved in this too as well. And we see situations where mobs in certain communities, take the laws into their own hands and carry out such kinds of gruesome acts. And we have seen also and heard also about various sects carrying out extrajudicial killings. And we also talk about torture and cruel treatments. Prisoners and detainees have been subjected to torture, cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatments, particularly during police interrogations. And if you go to many prisons in Nigeria, you find that people, especially prisoners, often suffer from abuse. And the prisons in most parts of Nigeria are overcrowded. There's inadequate medical care. There's food and water shortages and other numerous abuses sometimes involving the inmates. And the government has also been known to suppress free speech and assembly. And journalists have faced violence and threats, and criminal libel laws are often used to limit their ability to express themselves. So that happens a lot in Nigeria. And the judiciary faces challenges as well, including corruption and inefficiency. And this, in a way, undermines the rule of law and hinders the administration of justice for victims of human rights violations. So, yeah, that's another. Then we talk about forced evictions, where authorities have been carrying out these kinds of acts without adequate compensation or alternative housing. And we also talk about excessive use of force, in which security forces have used force in dispersing protesters. We've seen that happen in many cases. Then if you look at the non-state actors like jihadist groups like Boko Haram and the so-called Islamic State West Africa province, these groups have been responsible for numerous human rights violations, including killings, abductions, and displacement. And these all are used as acts of terrorism. And they're not alone. Vigilante groups have been involved in such kinds of acts. Bakassi boys, if you go back to the days in the Southeast, in the early 2001, in which the Bakassi boys in Anambra State were involved in human rights abuses, including extrajudicial killings and targeting of a particular ethnic group. So banditry and kidnapping has grown in recent years in Nigeria, where people are kidnapped for ransom, and that we've seen a lot happen in the northwestern part of Nigeria, and conflicts between Fulani herders and farmers have also led to various degrees of human rights abuses. And we could also mention other issues such as gender-based violence. Nigeria has a high rate of gender-based violence, including domestic violence, sexual violence, early and forced marriage. And these are all parts of.
Let me ask you all this though. So this is, it's an amazing list of, I've been to Nigeria many times, and Nigeria, as you know, is one of the fastest growing countries in the world. It's one of the most important countries in all of Africa. I mean, you paint a very dark picture of what's happening in Nigeria. Um, so what, these things you're talking about the government. Is it just the current government that's doing this? Has it been previous governments? Is this an ongoing trend, or do you think this current government is doing more to make it as dark as it is there? What do you think?
I think it's more or less a culture in governance, and it didn't start from 2003. It's an age-long thing. We've seen such acts, since the military regime and down until today, since Nigeria returned to democracy. May have been worse under the military, but we haven't seen so much in terms of change in behavior as far as law enforcement officials are concerned. You remember the NSAS protest in 2020, where hundreds of thousands of Nigerians took to the streets to protest against police brutality. And because this is what Nigerians have faced over the years. from the military era down to the Fourth Republic when democracy returned to Nigeria in 1999. So it's not peculiar to one government. It's a culture that we've seen, especially amongst security agencies, in the last 2, 3, 4 decades. Yeah.
Is it more of northern issue among the Muslim communities, or is it a southern issues as well among the Christian community? I mean, is there a breakdown among religious lines, or is it just national all across the country?
It depends on what you're looking at and what you're talking about. If we look at issue of terrorism, we find that it's more jihadist groups operating in the north, particularly in the northeastern part of the country. If you look at banditry, it's mostly common in the northwest, but we've seen incidents of banditry in the southwest as well. And when you talk about, armed groups who just rob people, and torture people and carry out ritual activities, we've seen that happen a lot in the southeastern part of Nigeria. So in different areas, in different regions of Nigeria, we see different kinds of criminal activities, so to speak, in which these criminal gangs are all involved in various degrees of human rights abuses. So it just depends on what you are talking about, the topic you're looking at here.
But is the human rights? But would you say that the human rights abuses that we're seeing in Nigeria are more caused by economic issues or cultural and religious and political issues?
But it's a combination of everything you've mentioned. Economic issues, yes. In this kind of scenario, we've seen um, robbery, theft grow, and oftentimes the people involved in this act usually want to torture their victims just to be able to force their families into paying ransoms in the cases of kidnapping. But when we talk about issues around jihadist, insurgency, that the people involved in this, are fighting for a so-called cause, seeking to establish a caliphate, like in the case of the Islamic State West Africa province. Um, so political in the sense that some people will clamoring for independence, secessionist. Well, that is political in that sense because it involves people calling for a new state. So there are also ethnic clashes. We've seen that in the northern part of Nigeria. We've also seen that in parts of the southern part of Nigeria. So the reasons are manifold, but it's all often economic driven in some way. Other ways, it's political and ethnic. Yeah.
A lot of people made the accusation that Buhari, when he was president, that when you talk about the ethnic battles, but like the Fulanis, and what's going on up there, a lot of people made the accusation that President Buhari did not do enough to kind of clamp down on the assaults against the Christian community. Do you think that's a fair accusation against President Buhari?
Well, it did seem as if his administration did not do enough because under him we saw like a spike in incidents involving Fulani headsmen, and we didn't hear so much of condemnation from his government, on this particular group of people, and we also didn't see so much in terms of arrests, in terms of prosecution. So it did seem at the time as if, not necessarily, I wouldn't say he protected them, but that was how it seemed. The fact that there wasn't so much in terms of prosecution, arrest and prosecution, then that made it very difficult for people to see him as transparent, in this regard, yeah.
And with under President Tinubu, I mean, what's happening? How would you rate, what his administration is doing in the regard of human rights violations in the country?
Again, because human rights issues are so embedded, in the country, especially when it comes to security for nations, it's always going to take time to be able to address these issues because it's a systemic issue. And I don't think we've seen so much of improvements. There probably are efforts by the administration, maybe, but we haven't had as much cases of human rights violations compared to what we saw, what we witnessed during the Buhari era. but I don't think that the security agencies have changed that much in terms of attitude and culture. I don't think that you even the groups that have been involved in terrorist activities and kidnapping have changed in their ideologies. But the fact that we've not witnessed much attacks on communities as it was the case under the past two administrations probably does show that there is improvement in terms of the way that the government have tackled these armed groups. I mean, banditry was very common under the previous administration. It's not gone away yet, but it's less than it was under the Buhari administration. So those are the gains you could give to the Tinubu government. But the culture of impunity that we see in security agencies, the culture of abuse that we have seen being carried out by security personnel still is very much there, because I've listened to many testimonies from people who have been in detention, who have been under arrest, and that hasn't changed that much. It's going to take much more than the president, to change these issues. It will take these institutions to take seriously the issue of respect for human rights. Yes.
And last week I had a guest on, and we talked about Boko Haram and the growth and whether or not Boko Haram is making a resurgence. Would you say that they're making a resurgence in the country?
Well, I have a lot of contacts and friends in the northeastern part of the country, and if you have to be fair to the current administration, you will be able to say that in the last couple of years, say 2 years, for example, Boko Haram had been degraded. But recently we've heard about pockets of attacks in one or two communities, and that probably may show a resurgence. But to what degree, I don't know, because we've seen this in the past where after a long time, terrorist groups like, Ansaru, Boko Haram, just because they want to be heard, all of a sudden begin to carry out pockets of attacks. But I know that they don't have the same capability as they had a decade ago. They've been, strongly degraded, but they're still there. ISPAP members are still active in parts of Borno State. Boko Haram members are still active in parts of Borno State as well. So how much they can put themselves together and carry out activities in the ways that we've seen in the past, I doubt that that will be possible now. I don't know what the future says, but Boko Haram still remains a little threat for the group that has been muchly decapacitated. Yeah.
Well, we have just a few more minutes here to talk about Nigeria before we get to larger continent. I mean, let me ask you about the U.S. Have you seen with the current administration in the U.S. Is it is it tending to do you see that their support is waning? America's support is waning for Nigeria and human rights abuses, or do you see that it's still the same as it was in previous administrations?
Well, President Trump has been in office for about 3 months now, and I'll say it's still very early to conclude whether or not U.S. support under him is better or has gotten worse. My eyes are still on what the Americans are doing in Nigeria, as it has been in the last 3 months on everywhere else in Africa. But the fact that U.S. funding has been cut, U.S. funding for USAID, which I can now say is defunct, has been cut. Funding for international projects, including projects that focus on human rights, have all but disappeared. That will tell what countries that depend a lot on American funding to combat human rights abuses will face going forward. So it is going to get a little worse going forward. And maybe I should say that it's already bad, because when you cut funding, then you probably have cut over 90% of the tool that people have to fight issues around human rights and what have you. So yes, I don't foresee the coming weeks or even months getting better in terms of what Nigeria can achieve in areas where they depended a lot on US funding. Yeah.
I mean, it's a big issue around the world, and I've noticed it a lot in the in Southeast Asia. Where the USAID has been very fundamental in trying to stop the terrorist activities and human rights abuses. But according to the National Human Rights Commission, human rights violations in Nigeria rose by 25% in February of 2025. Does that sound accurate to you? And if so, why is that increase happening?
Well, 25% sounds huge. And I'm beginning to wonder as to why it rose by that amount in February alone. And we cannot um, say this is as a result of reduced or like I said, funding that has disappeared from the US. But we have seen a resurgence of attacks in certain communities. Just now I saw the report about what's going on in Plateau State and what have you. But again, things are not getting better for many Nigerians economically. Things are tough, and we're seeing that armed groups are beginning to organize themselves again and then do what they've been doing all these years, terrorizing people, attacking people, and what have you. But then again, communal clashes are growing. And if 25% rise was what happened in February, I expect that to be higher at the end of April with the ethnic tension that we see in Plateau states and in neighboring states. So 25% rise is actually shocking, alarming. I'm wondering myself why it got to that number. But I do also know that we've seen, resurgent communal clashes in parts of North Africa, in part of northern Nigeria, sorry. And even though I'm surprised at 25%, but I'm not surprised that there's an increase here.
Well, I mean, we've talked a lot. We've touched a lot on what I mean when we talk about human rights violations. It's a broad topic, right? And one thing that I've seen in a lot of African nations and in Nigeria is sexual and gender-based violence. And that's and what I've seen around the world. And first, I'd like to get your thoughts on this. Is that when the economy gets worse, sexual and gender-based violence increases. Would you agree with that statement?
Of course, I agree totally. And it happens in different ways. Some people are frustrated that they're not able to make ends meet. And then they take their frustration on vulnerable women and girls. And there's also a situation where because people have to survive, women have to feed their children, and young girls have to help support their families, and then they somehow become very vulnerable to being targeted by men. And some of them too, they have to get in contact with some people that they ordinarily would not be in contact with if things were going very well. So economic downturn, economic issues can make women very vulnerable by being in areas where normally they wouldn't be. But again, survival is a very big issue, and having to find ways of surviving puts people in very big risks, makes them very vulnerable and susceptible to issues
Well, let me
around.
ask this too, Sue, because when you talk about sexual and gender-based violence, it's what I've seen sadly in other countries is that law enforcement doesn't like to prosecute men or arrest men who were involved in sexual violence. I mean, is that a case and a concern in Nigeria?
Yeah, I've had cases like this too in Nigeria where um, when it comes to issues around sexual violence, people look at the women as culprits rather than victims. And there's some people with that mentality thinking that the man has the right to do anything he can as far as dealing with a woman is concerned. So yes, I have had cases like that to answer your question, then, and which is very sad. And I wouldn't say it's rampant, but I would say it's happened. It has happened, and some people have even spoken to me about this. Yeah.
Well, the one thing I keep hearing about Nigeria, and not to pick on Nigeria, but this is the next segment, we'll talk about all of Africa, and I see this globally, is that, a lot of human rights abuses, they really, it starts at the top. I mean, it really does. And I know, listen, you're a Nigerian, you have to be careful, I guess, what you say about the current administration. I understand that. But the reality is, You look at these arbitrary detentions, you look at the growth of sexual and gender-based violence, you looked at, some people would say just random killings by law enforcement in the country. Um, to me, it boils down to a governmental issue. I mean, leadership. We're seeing that around the world, um, and I think that in the absence of global, when you don't have people like the United States and the European Union and others trying to help and mitigate some of these things, really the burden on the current government is even more. And so I do have a concern and I hate to say as blatant it is, but I think the government there is failing, failing the people in this regard, and something needs to change. And it's Nigeria has money. I mean, I know it's there's a lot of poverty, but there is if you don't bring law and order, if you don't address human rights abuses, that does impact your economy as well. So I just think that the government needs to make some substantive changes in that regard. Well, but sadly, let's take a quick break around the world, and we're going to come back and talk about more about this. Okay, thanks a lot. Hello, my name is Dane Waters, and once again, we're back with Around the World with Dane Waters. Um, what I want to show you in the background, you see up above my shoulder there, is Ho Chi Minh. This is a country which was founded on communism. Ho Chi Minh is the leader. Ho Chi Minh's on the money. Ho Chi Minh's on the signs. Ho Chi Minh is everywhere. They even renamed Saigon Ho Chi Minh City. And it's amazing when you think about it in a city in a time like today where communism is vibrant. But what we're going to see, sadly, is that as America abdicates its responsibilities globally, countries like Vietnam and those other communist countries like China and Iran and North Korea are going to take a more active role in filling the void left by America. You already feel it here in Saigon or Ho Chi Minh City, where America with USAID is pulled out, and now China is making a big push back, which is why President Xi was just in the country talking about that. Anyway, we'll talk more about this as we get ready to celebrate here in this country the 50th anniversary of the reunification, basically when they kicked America out. But we'll talk more about it later. Thanks. Welcome back to Around the World with Dane Waters with my guest, Philip Obaji. You just told me earlier, and I can't even still remember what it is. I'm losing my mind here. Well, thanks for being with us. And, for the first segment, we were talking about human rights abuses in Nigeria, and it, and that little segment you just saw about me broadcasting from Ho Chi Minh City. I mean, what I'm seeing, sadly, is human rights abuses around the world are growing exponentially. And I think it has a lot to do, as we talked about, in many ways, economic issues. But it's also female violence, sexual and gender-based violence, as they call it, is a huge issue, especially growing in the Middle East and Africa. And so, what I want to do now is kind of talk about what is the influence of foreign actors in this regard. For example, what I saw in Asia, like in Vietnam, is that you have Russia and you have Iran and you have China all influencing the narrative in that country and in that region, and taking advantage of, I would say, taking advantage of if there's a split among the population, they'll take advantage of that. So let's talk about first. Let me go back to Nigeria specifically, and then we'll go to the rest of Africa. Are you concerned that when you see these human rights abuses and the growing human rights abuses in the country, and the fact that there was a drastic increase in human rights abuses in the last, two things could be happening. One is a lack of the government doing what it should do, which I think, number one, at the end of the day, it's their responsibility to do more. But number two, do you think the rise of human rights violations in Nigeria has anything to do with foreign actors getting more actively involved in the country?
No, I don't think the foreign actors are, you know, I don't think the involvement of foreign actors is so huge that it will contribute significantly to the rise of human rights abuse in Nigeria. Of course, the foreign actors are involved, especially we've seen a situation where Chinese employers, treat many of their staff like slaves, where you have to make them work, you know, have the day 12 hours nonstop. You don't have a few minutes break for lunch, for example. So that's a level of human rights abuse that has always been in Nigeria for years, for decades, and no one has done anything about that. So, but that contributes only a fraction to the human rights abuse cases that Nigeria has experienced. Yeah, but if we continue to have more foreign investments from Asia, where you have companies from China, for example, you know, established in Nigeria, as Nigeria wants to see, companies from around the world coming to create factories and open offices in Nigeria, then if we have that growth, then we may see growth in cases of human rights abuses. Yes, we've seen companies from South Asia involved in treat their workers and their staff in very inhumane, ways. So yes, I would
Well,
say that yes,
I'm going to deal with a very sensitive subject here. It's sexual violence. I mean, it's a huge issue, and I've seen that sexual violence has been used in many ways from dictators on down to kind of as a tool to rein in the population. In Africa, we're just going to talk about the continent wide now. Do you see that this types of sexual violence is growing in the continent?
of course. I mean, I'm a journalist and I've covered conflicts across West and Central Africa. And one of the weapons of war that I have come to see is issues around sexual violence, rape, and what have you, sexual abuse. And that's very common in countries that are in conflict. In the Central African Republic, where I have covered the operations of Russian paramilitaries in the country, I have established over 100 cases of human rights abuses, particularly sexual violence. Yes, and in one report that I did a couple of months ago, that's last year, I found that Russian paramilitaries actually raped hundreds of girls, women and girls, in a military base in the northwestern part of the country. So it's not just in the Central African Republic. We've seen such reports in Mali, and elsewhere. So when it comes to foreign actors being involved in sexual violence in countries where you have paramilitaries, especially from Russia, that cases of human rights abuses in the aspect of sexual violence is huge. Yes.
And what is the world doing about it? I mean, who's trying to deter? I mean, I hate to keep going back to the common link because listen, I'm really worried about the whole. I'm really worried about the world, just fundamentally about where we're going. And America is pulling back and saying that Russia is Europe's problem and all that kind of stuff, and
Yeah.
they may focus on Asia, but who is leading in the world these days, in your opinion, to try to help stop these attacks? Is the African Union doing enough, or is the African governments themselves doing enough, or what do we need to do to try to address some of these issues?
Well, it's a huge political call. And just like what's happening in Ukraine with Russia invading Ukraine, and then the EU is finding it very difficult to do anything about it. The same scenario in Africa. And the worst punishment that Russia has had is economic sanctions. But how much is that hurting Russia, and how much has it made Russia backtrack? You can answer that for yourself. But clearly, the answer is that very little. It has had very little impact on the Russian Federation. Well, but what can the African Union do? I don't. It's a difficult question, because if you don't send troops into these countries to chase Russia away, then the Russians will continue to remain there. But it's also even impossible to do so, because you don't want to create more casualties and then get into a stand-up or a face-off with Russia. So, but at least I think that, countries in Africa, the African Union can start with condemning these acts, because I haven't heard, I've been covering Russian operations in Africa for the past 7 years, and I haven't heard the African Union condemn what Russia is doing in the Central African Republic and in Mali. I haven't heard for once. So it begins from there. If you cannot even say something about it, then it means that you cannot even do anything else, to stop the situation. So, and that
So
is
so
very,
so
very.
why is that? I would argue, why is the African Union afraid? I was in Ethiopia when the African Union met a few months ago, a couple months ago, and we were talking. I mean, they seem to be very focused on restitution, from the world about slavery, which I understand is a huge issue. But when women and children are literally being raped and killed in your
Mm,
country, I mean, in your continent, I mean, that is a population. I mean, I'll be very clear. If you rape a woman or a child, you should be put to death. I'll be blunt about that. That is a line in the sand that you cannot cross. But it seems to
mm.
be getting more and more prevalent in the country. And to go back to your economic sanctions, listen, an economic sanction isn't going to stop a Russian paramilitary person in Nigeria or Niger or wherever from raping a woman or a child. It's just not going to happen. And this is where the governments have to take a more active stand. And I agree that an all-out conflict is not good, but you're just kicking the can down the road, as they say, if you don't confront it now. So um, I don't know. I mean, it's a very sad situation. But I mean, what are the so what is the answer? I mean, here's the question. I mean, I keep asking, what is the answer? How do you fix this? I mean, and I hate to keep rambling here, but you have USAID, for example, which is now pulling out a lot of support
Mm.
to help human rights abuses around the country, around the world. A lot of people don't understand the importance of USAID funding in these regards, but that money is being gone as well because of the Trump cuts. But where do we go from this? Because I'm afraid that in countries like Nigeria, even though you say it's not becoming much of an issue, that as Nigeria becomes more divided economically, socially, ethnically, the Russians are going to play ball in that country. They're not going
Of
to go
course.
away.
Yeah, of course. So what we've been seeing is that the Russians are spreading disinformation across West Africa and across Central Africa, and this campaign is huge because they're targeting, local communities. They're using the media to spread this campaign, this disinformation, and what they're doing is huge. I'm even seeing major newspapers in Nigeria carry stories and publish articles that are clearly Russian-sponsored disinformation. You go to social media, which is being used by millions of Nigerians. You see some accounts, some social media accounts with massive following, spreading Russian disinformation. They've either been paid by some of these Russian units that are responsible for spreading this information in Africa, or maybe they've been influenced by the narrative that's out there regarding how Russia is the answer to the problems in Africa. So, how I look at it, the bottom line is that Russia's disinformation campaign is growing across Africa, and many Africans are now beginning to see Russia as the answer to its problems as against the West. So, and that's a big concern. That's a very huge concern because if nothing is done and Russian disinformation is allowed to spread, then what will happen is that democracies may even fall. Already we're seeing a military governments, military dictatorship grow in West Africa, and virtually all these military juntas are allied with Russia. So that's what Russia wants. And if you have a situation where you have military dictatorship return to certain parts of Africa or to more countries in Africa, then you are going to have a situation where human rights abuses will increase because don't have you can never find an administration more violent towards its people than military governments. So that's my concern. And then because nothing has been done, very little has been done to tackle Russia disinformation, I fear that, somehow the Russians may have it their way.
No, and that's a concern of mine, and I see it all. I literally see it all over the world. I mean, when I travel, South Africa, excuse me, South America, Africa, Southeast Asia, Europe. I mean, Russia is everywhere, and this is what we have to get across to the viewers, is that people think about Ukraine and Russia war, why it doesn't matter to me, and then you have Donald Trump, President Trump saying, well, it's on the other side of the ocean.
Mhm.
It's BS. It's BS because you don't have to have troops on your soil for
Yep,
Russia to be a problem. You don't. And with what's happening or most likely to happen in the Ukraine-Russian war, where territorial integrity is not respected, human rights abuses, and when Putin is not prosecuted for war crimes, the message that sends to Russia specifically is that we'll just do more wherever we want to.
that's
Nigeria
correct.
is not safe. I mean, I want to be very clear about that
Okay.
to the audience. Nigeria is not safe. Okay. Russia wants the oil, wants the minerals, wants access. I mean, how many, let me ask you this, around Nigeria and West Africa, how many countries have fallen because of Russian influence in West Africa?
Well, there are countries that really, even before military dictatorship, began, there were some countries where the Russians were looking at or with disinformation. One of those countries is Mali. The other one is Burkina Faso, and then most recently Niger. So I wouldn't say their fall is completely tied to Russian influence, but the Russians did play a little role because if you even look at the military junta that's in power in Mali, my investigation in 2020 uncovered, a plan by the military officers who took power. They went to Russia, stayed in Russia for about 6, 7 months, and then returned and seized power, which tells that the coup was coordinated in Russia. And the military officers that first truncated democracy in Burkina Faso actually wanted the Russian Wagner group to be involved in operations in the country against jihadist insurgents. So once the president rejected that proposal, he was toppled. So you see that Russia has somehow had an influence in the way the military operated in these countries. So you're right that no country is safe in Africa. Even Nigeria isn't safe. If you look at the antecedents of the Russian Federation, how much they were involved in the coups that took place in Mali and to some extent in Burkina Faso. Yeah.
Has the current Nigerian government condemned what's happening with Russian aggression across the continent? Have they?
Well, I haven't come across any statement or report that says that the government of Nigeria has condemned that. But I know that they condemns the coup in West Africa, the coup in Niger, which is the most recent of our coups. So in that regard, yes. But in terms of condemning Russian operations, I haven't come across any statement or report that suggests that.
Well, listen, we have to leave here in a minute. This is my concern: is that it's what's happening in the Russian-Ukraine war, where Russia is doing whatever they want to do, basically, and then now we're hoping Europe takes a more active role. No one wants a no one wants a world war, right? I don't think you want a world war.
Of course
However,
not.
we don't, and I have friends whose kids are getting military age, and they definitely don't want it. But the reality is, war is inevitable if we don't if we don't find a way to condemn this and stop what's happening, especially with human rights abuses. And not to emotionalize this discussion, but women and children are literally dying and being, they're dying, they're being murdered, they're being raped, they're being,
That's right.
they're very, what's the word I'm looking for? They're a focus because as fathers, as husbands, you know, we know firsthand, the emotional toll that it has on us if our wives or children are assaulted or abused. Anyway,
Yeah.
the last question for you, and then we got to go. Any words of advice for the Nigerian government and any other governments about what's coming and what they should do?
Oh, yes. I think one of the most critical cases or situations that African governments will face going forward is the influence of the Russian Federation. Its disinformation campaign is growing at levels that no one has ever seen before. So my advice to the government is you have to set up programs that will counter these narratives and put out what is true. Because as long as the people continue to read and consume this information that the Russians are putting out there, what they're doing is that they're asking people to migrate to Europe, that Europe offers better opportunities, putting them at risk, by crossing the Sahara Desert and the Mediterranean Sea. So please create programs that counters Russian disinformation and programs that will really spread what's true out there. And also take seriously the issues of human rights abuses. And there's there's a culture of impunity in Nigeria's institutions. And my advice is that you have to do something to create a better culture and respect for human rights here.
Well, listen, Philip, thank you for all that you do, and thanks for your reporting on this. It's very helpful for all of us around the world who try to track this stuff. You're doing phenomenal work, and I applaud your efforts. So, Thank you for being on the show today. And thanks to the audience for joining me, Dane Waters, for Around the World with Dane Waters. And we will see you next week with more happenings around the world. Thank you.